this is an experiment. It's the first time we've had this many people in this room, and the first time apparently we've had mics that don't necessarily work. So anyway, this is one of our breakfast series, which is one of our important events where we try to advocate and educate people about the Air Force. We are so happy the Secretary is here today because this is one of the events we have where Air Force leaders can talk directly to members of industry, to our allied partners, to think tanks, to congressional staff, and to the media about the crucial role that the Air Force and cyber power plays in our nation's security. The Air Force Association was formed 70 years ago at the same time that the Air Force became a separate service with a mission of promoting the value of air and space power. This mission is particularly important today when so few of our fellow citizens and our members of Congress have actually served in the military. And that's why AFA will continue to focus our attention on telling the Air Force story through events like this, through our Mitchell Institute events here on Capitol Hill and throughout the country, and of course in our publications and our press work. We're very pleased to have as our speaker today the 24th Secretary of the Air Force, the Honorable Heather Wilson. Secretary Wilson grew up in an aviation family. Her grandfather, I am told, was an avid flyer and a barnstormer and an early member of the Civil Air Patrol. Her father was an Air Force pilot as well, and apparently once built an airplane inside their house. I've heard of people building boats in the basement, but airplanes in the house, that's something different. And she was flying in her family's aircraft before she could ride a bicycle. So it'd be easy to say that it was natural for young Heather Wilson to head off to the Air Force Academy in 1978, but I think that understates the courage that it took for young women to embark on a military career in the late 1970s. Now, I recognize that I am probably older than everybody in this room, but I remember that it was a path back in the 70s that very few women took. When I left active duty at the end of 1972, for example, I had not met or even seen a woman officer in the Navy. Women were first allowed to serve on Navy ships in the same year that Dr. Wilson arrived at the Academy. And the restriction on women flying in combat was still to be lifted about 14 years after she started in Colorado Springs. But against the odds, she came to the Academy and thrived. She was the first woman to command basic training and the first woman to serve as vice commander of the cadet wing. She graduated at the top of her class and was selected to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, where she earned both a master's and a PhD. After 7 years of active duty and time on the National Security Council staff, she was elected to Congress representing New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, which is around Albuquerque, from 1998 to 2009, where she was a member of the Intelligence Committees and Armed Services Committees. Most recently, she was the president of the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City, South Dakota. For those of you who have not been in Rapid City, and I know many of you have been there since Ellsworth is there, the School of Mines is a preeminent engineering school. Started in 1885, less than a decade after Custer's last stand. And during the Secretary's time at school, I love this. During her time at the school, it was ranked as one of America's best buys in education, and its graduates earned more than the graduates of my alma mater, Harvard. So I think that's really quite an achievement. Dr. Wilson, I think, is also the only Air Force Secretary in at least the last 20 years, perhaps forever, who can actually fly an airplane. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Heather Wilson.
Good morning to all of you. It's wonderful to be with you. And Larry, thank you for your leadership of the Air Force Association. And Whit, thank you for your kind introduction. Arnie Bunch is also here. He's probably the person that most of you want to talk to.
Yes, ma'am.
It's good to
Yes, ma'am.
I never go anywhere without somebody covering my six. So thank you very much, Arnie, for being here. And Lisa Disbrow, the Undersecretary, is also with us today. And she was the acting secretary for several months before I arrived and has helped me tremendously in this transition. And I just wanted to publicly thank you for your service to the United States. 73 years ago today, so on the 6th of June, 1944, 77 B-29 Superfortress bombers took off from a strip in India and bombed railroad shops in Bangkok, Thailand. 10 days later, those B-29s took off from China, and they bombed the Imperial Iron and Steel Works on mainland Japan. That was the first strike on Japan since the Doolittle Raiders had a one-way trip in 1942. It was a revolutionary day in American history, in the history of air power. One of those B-29s that were coming off the lines in Washington and Omaha and Wichita was eventually named the Enola Gay. It was an ambitious project at the time, and it was fraught with difficulty from the very beginning, because we were pushing the bounds of human knowledge and technical capability. The United States was going to build a bomber that could fly 5,000 miles with a 1-ton payload. It was the first pressurized cockpit so that the crew could fly at 40,000 feet in altitude in the year 1944. The wingspan of this aircraft was longer than the first flight by the Wrights. There were 4 2,200 horsepower engines on this thing. They were radial engines with 18 cylinders made out of specialty alloy. We'd never done anything like this before. And Boeing had to invent a manufacturing process to extrude an alloy of aluminum to make wing spars in a way that had never been done before. It was a program that was fraught with problems. There were miles of electrical wiring in this thing that had bad connections. There were pressure seals that were linking. There were engines that were suffering catastrophic failure in flight. And Hap Arnold and Senator Harry Truman were livid at the delays. So when things were still not going right, Hap Arnold went out to Wichita. He said, "I want this airplane flying and ready for combat in 2 months," and signed his name on a fuselage. And 2 months later, he still didn't have it. And so he sent a guy named General Bennett Myers to get the program back on track. And they pulled the wiring, they pulled crews from all over the country to get this bomber in the air and get it into combat. They didn't have hangars big enough for the B-29. So crews were working outside in the frigid cold to get this thing to work. That bomber changed the course of the war. And the persistence in advancing technology changed the course of history. Last week, General Chris Bogdan retired. More than anyone else, he is responsible for the successful persistence of the F-35 fighter program. After cost overruns and schedule slippages, he took over the program, and he got it working, and he got it fixed. The price per plane is coming down, and the people who fly it are just now realizing that it will change the way we fight and win in the air. We're changing the game because we're advancing technology. So last week, Chris Bogdan retired, and he's done tremendous work for the United States Air Force and for advancing technology so that we can win the fight. And we're all deeply grateful to him. The Air Force has always been about advancing technology to project power, because in concert with our allies, we have to own the high ground. We have to be able to take the fight to the end. And the challenges that we face at the moment are pretty significant. This year's budget reflects the heritage of innovators, and it reflects our commitment to restore readiness and lethality of the force. When I came back to the service after several years away and delightfully ensconced in Rapid City, South Dakota, I was surprised by a few things in my kind of run-up to confirmation. One of them was the first slide that I saw on readiness. When I was a young lieutenant, I remember the weekly stand-up briefings at Headquarters 3rd Air Force at RAF Millen Hall. And one of the first slides that would go up was the readiness of every wing and 3rd Air Force. If we had seen numbers then, like I saw when I returned and got my first briefing on readiness here in the Air Force today, if we had seen those kind of numbers during the Cold War, the general I worked for would have blown a gasket. The United States Air Force is a third smaller than it was during Desert Storm. We have 5,500 aircraft compared to 8,600 at the time of Desert Storm. That means we have 55 combat-rated squadrons. Before 1991, we were buying over 500 aircraft a year on average. Since 1991, the United States Air Force has been buying on average less than 100 a year. Our average aircraft age is 27 years old. The average age is 27 years old. We've been involved in combat for 26 straight years. And most Americans don't know that. If you talk to a high school kid or a kid in college today and ask him how long has the Air Force been in combat, many of them don't even know that we're conducting strikes today in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. In fact, in 2014, when ISIS reared its ugly head, it was the United States Air Force that surged to the fight. There have been 26,000 sorties and airstrikes against ISIS since 2014. 26,000 airstrikes. 70% of those have been conducted by the United States Air Force. We surged to the fight. We have adversaries who are seeking to undermine the credibility of our alliances and neutralize our ability to project power. And the reality is that we are too small for what the nation expects of us, and it is unlikely that the need for air and space power will diminish significantly over the next decade. So what do we do about it? The fiscal year 17 appropriations stopped the decline. This proposed budget for fiscal year 18 starts to restore readiness and modernize the force. But more than anything else, we need predictability. The United States Air Force needs predictability. If we don't provide relief from the Budget Control Act, we will further hollow out the force and set ourselves back years. We have to get beyond the Budget Control Act. This budget also assumes something else, and it's one of the things that perhaps we take for granted as Americans, but we shouldn't. This budget assumes that the United States will remain a global power, which means we need global mobility, global intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, global strike, the ability to fight anytime, anywhere, and when. So this budget does a few things. The first is that it focuses on restoring readiness. Last year, the budget took active duty Air Force manpower from about 317,000 to 321,000. And next year, with this budget that we've proposed and that the chief and I will start to defend tomorrow, we will go to 325,000 active duty airmen. When you add in the Guard, the Reserve, and additional civilians, we'll be going up to about 669,000 in the United States Air Force. Now, where do we put those people? Maintainers? Absolutely critical. Expanding pilot training. We're going to expand 2 more flying training units. Increase the number of remotely piloted vehicle operators. And fill some critical gaps in some other capabilities like cyber. Pilot retention right now is at crisis levels when it comes to fighters. And we're changing around the way we're doing incentive pay. We've added in significant administrative support to the squadrons, which was taken away in the wake of sequester. So our approach to pilot retention will be both financial and non-financial to try to make it better for pilots to be able to stay in the United States Air Force. The budget includes flying hours at the maximum executable levels and near maximum executable levels for spare parts, for maintenance, and logistics. With respect to munitions, the budget also includes some expanded work with factories. We are now expending more munitions in Iraq and Syria than we are producing, and we need to reverse that trend. So today I'm also announcing the details of a tiered aviation bonus system, which was authorized by the Congress last year. It's intended to encourage pilots to stay where we need them most, so the bonuses are higher for those where the need is most critical. It also gives flexibility in length of contracts, so that pilots have more say about the length of their commitment, and we hope this will help us to keep more pilots in the Air Force. In addition to restoring readiness, we have to start to focus on lethality and making sure we modernize for the long term. The budget includes several things with respect to modernization. The top 3 priorities are fighters, bombers, and tankers. With respect to fighters, we will be buying 46 more F-35A aircraft. The night before I was sworn in as Secretary of the Air Force, I had dinner at Air House with General Goldfein and Amir Eshel, the Commander-in-Chief of the Israeli Air Force. Now, unlike our Air Force, where we don't allow generals to fly anymore, right? And if you're wondering, they don't allow the Secretary to fly anymore. The Israelis do it differently. If you're a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, no matter what your rank, you spend at least 1 day a week flying. They are the definition of a ready combat force. When I first met Amir and sat next to him at dinner that night, the night before I was sworn in as a secretary, the first thing he said was that he now had 7 sorties in the F-35. And he said, "This changes everything. This changes everything. There is nothing like it." This is a guy who's flown the F-16, the F-4, the F-15, and he's flown them in combat. And he could not stop raving about this advancement in technical capability. With respect to bombers, we are moving forward with the B-21 penetrating bomber. The development continues. With tankers, the KC-46 is now in testing, and we will buy 15 of them this year. Of course, those aren't the only things. There are upgrades of current fighters and bombers, and Reapers and Global Hawk combat rescue, and airborne warning upgrades to continue modernization across the board. We were also moving forward with the modernization of the nuclear deterrent. The Air Force is responsible for 2 legs of the triad, and life extension is no longer a feasible option. We're talking about 1970s and 1980s, not only technology, but materials. And life extension just doesn't work anymore. We're going to have to renew the triad. With respect to space, it's one of the things I'm most excited about returning to federal service, is that the Secretary of the Air Force is actually the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense with respect to space. Of course, the Air Force has been the leader on space for 54 years. But some things have changed. I was actually on the House Intelligence Committee in 2007 when the Chinese demonstrated a kinetic intercept of one of their dead weather satellites and, oh, by the way, spread debris all over everywhere. It's been clear since then, if it wasn't clear to everyone before then, that space will be a contested domain. Our adversaries know that we are heavily dependent upon space, and we need to develop the ability to be not only resilient in space, but to be able to reconstitute, to disperse our capability, to build in redundancy, to use deception, and defend ourselves in space, so that those who depend on space capabilities, which includes all of the branches of the service, can rely on them when it matters most. So we need assured access to space, and this budget moves us forward in that way. A couple of weeks ago, I did go out to Colorado Springs and got to spend some time at Schriever and Peake Field at Space Command Northcom and the National Space Defense Center. The National Space Defense Center, which also is it continues to be funded in this year's budget, is developing new operating concepts for space. We are also looking at new ways to train our people in space. So to change the culture from one of monitoring what's there and operating satellites to thinking about how will we prepare and fight through in space. It is joint, it is interagency, and it is starting to make a difference. With respect to space, the Air Force will continue to integrate, normalize, and elevate space as part of the joint warfighting team. We're also going to need to streamline procurement of some things that people need for space and other things. But the budget this year increases from $6.5 billion to $7.8 billion for space through the Air Force. Now we're going to have to move faster on a lot of things because our adversaries are innovating faster than we are. We have to get from concept to warfighter faster. And this budget includes something a little bit new. We're going to be doing an attack aircraft experiment. It is not a procurement, it is an experiment. But this experiment that will take place at White Sands in August will actually have a flight test and fly off in August, 10 months after the concept was approved by the Chief of Staff. 10 months from concept to fly off. Now I have to say again, because General Bunch will ring my ears if I don't, it's not a procurement. It is an experiment. But we want to see what the experiment tells us and whether we can move forward with a different way of getting capability from the lab bench to the flight line and the warfighter faster. Because all of us know that that's one of the ways to win. I believe also, as does the Secretary of Defense, that we are stronger together than we are alone, and that we work in concert with our allies to defend the vital national interests of the United States. This budget also includes an additional piece of funding for the European Security Initiative. And the United States Air Force, as it's part of that, will be sending a unit of F-16s from the National Guard to Europe next January for 3 months in order to train with our European allies. We are committed to defend our allies and ourselves in a concept of collective self-defense, which has kept us safe for many decades. 73 years ago, the B-29 bomber was the single most expensive weapons project undertaken by the United States in World War II. It wasn't the Manhattan Project, it was the B-29 bomber. It was 1938 when President Roosevelt made a decision. He made that decision informed by Charles Lindbergh's trip to Germany to see what the Germans were doing with aircraft. He came back with an alarming report. And with Hap Arnold's ideas about what the Air Force might do to counter the gathering storm. Roosevelt made an important decision, a decision to develop the ability to project power globally, to drive innovation toward that goal. The path he chose wasn't straight, and it wasn't easy. But in his memoirs, Hap Arnold said, "A battle was won in the White House on that day, which took its place with, or at least led to, the victories in combat later. We must think in terms of tomorrow. We must develop and field new capabilities to protect the country that we love." Thank you all for being willing to engage in that effort.
This is a room full of people who have lots of questions. Often they go on forever. So we're going to ask people to please try to do short questions. One question, and get an answer. So with that, there are people with microphones in the room. And if you put up your hand and wait till you get a microphone, that would be great.
Hi, Secretary Wilson. Tara Cobb with Stars and Stripes. I wanted to get your thoughts on Saudi Arabia's announcement that it was cutting off any travel and aid in relations with Qatar, particularly when you consider the importance of Al Udeid Air Base to U.S. air operations against the Islamic State?
I saw that in the news this morning as well. It's largely a diplomatic issue, and Secretary Tillerson has made some comments on that. It hasn't changed our operations at all at Al Udeid, and obviously it's more of a diplomatic issue at the moment, and Secretary Tillerson has made some comments on that, but it has not affected our operations.
Good morning. Sean Carberry with Federal Computer Week. You mentioned some of the plus up in personnel is going to go to filling some cyber gaps. Wanted to see if you could expand a bit about what those gaps are, and also if you've had a chance to get up to speed on the cyber campaign plan and thoughts about where that is and any changes in direction you might make to that.
Having been on the job all of 4 weeks now, I get to about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and my head feels like oatmeal for breakfast. So, the budget includes 39 cyber operations teams. So that is kind of an increase, and we tried to focus on those teams. There's also a number of other upgrades and changes in concepts for how we want to protect ourselves in cyber, and particularly probably moving towards more routine operations that are done by contractors, and training our cyber teams to focus not on whether my computer works this morning, but more on cyber operations for offense and defense. I think the number that I saw in the briefings that I was doing, the cyber operators in the Air Force are protecting against about 40 malicious attempts or attacks per second on the United States Air Force. So it's a capability that's important. In addition to those kinds of things, with space, we know that we may be vulnerable there, and we're doing a number of upgrades this next year to try to secure our ability to operate through GPS, for example, a military mode for GPS to try to make sure that we can be resilient against any cyber attack there. And this is probably one where General Bunch can probably fill you in on more details that I probably can't just standing here.
Ma'am, Sydney Friedberg from Breaking Defense. So get another reporter. Let me ask a big picture question. You said, okay, there's this legacy going back to B-29 of technological breakthrough. Sort of the F-35 is the B-29 of today. So what do you think is the B-29 of tomorrow? I mean, is it going to be cyber, artificial intelligence, frickin' laser beams? I mean, what are the technologies that you're looking at going, this could be the next B-29?
One of the things that we do increase in this budget is research, development, test, and evaluation. But as you probably know and others know, the amount of increase is really more on the test and evaluation end than it is on the R&D end. The actual R&D end is pretty flat and has been for several years. One of the things that we do kind of foreshadow in this budget is a desire to increase basic and applied research. Now, the other thing that is in the budget at a significant level is the future penetrating air defense capabilities. And we'll be looking at a lot of different technologies to make sure that we can win the high-end fight long term. So there's a fair amount of research in that. I won't speculate here about where the likely directions are going to be able to prevail in the long term. And I probably should never speculate too much publicly about those things.
Hi, Vivian Mashi with National Defense Magazine. Talking in the vein of.
So how come all the contractors are being so quiet in this? Oh, sorry.
Jumping at the opportunity here. Talking about the need to be ahead of our adversaries. Can you talk a bit about the priority you place on technologies such as hypersonics? How will you work to promote the work coming out of the AFRL, other industries in that vein? Thank you.
I look forward to going to Dayton. I'll be there in the last week of June to take a look at where research is going. There are a number of long-term technologies that are funded for research, including hypersonics, but there's also money in the budget for the Missile Defense Agency for counter-hypersonics as well. So
one of the things I think all of us are concerned about is the pace of innovation that's taking place in the countries of potential adversaries, which means we have to be able to innovate faster and turn tighter. And we're already getting to the point where General Goldfein and I are stealing each other's stories, so I'm going to steal one of his. Many of you know that he was assigned at Holloman when the 117 was there, and he was talking about where that technology came from. It actually didn't come from government, and it didn't come from a requirement statement. It came from an engineer working in the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works who was reading in his off time translated Russian technical documents and figured out that there was a way to design a shape that would make something low observable to radar. And he understood it. He then went out to his wood shop and kind of made that shape, showed it to the chief engineer at the Skunk Works, who said, "You think you can make this thing fly?" And they did. And they tested it against tested its radar cross-section, came in to, I think, the chief of staff, it may have been the Secretary of the Air Force, with a marble, and rolled it across the table. He said, "This aircraft has the radar cross-section of an eagle's eye." That didn't come from a requirement. Innovation doesn't always come from something the government sets out. It comes from your laboratories. So if I could do one thing today, which I should have done and gone to the toy store, is to give each one of you who are in industry a marble. And when you think you have that idea that changes the course of history, I want you to come and roll the marble across the table to me and Dave Goldfein. Because it's not just us, it's all of you too.
Good morning, Secretary. Thanks for the inspiring comments this morning. John Simmons with the Roosevelt Group and Ms. Kathleen Ferguson, who did the Air Force BRAC and strategic basing. So I'm going to ask the question we were debating in the car. With F-35 basing coming up in the Air Guard, you saw what happened up in Vermont, long drawn out lawsuits. You have a BRAC coming up. What is the Air Force thoughts about sending a message now that if communities are going to sue the Air Force and are not interested in taking these new missions on, that that's going to be part of the strategic basing decision?
We have a strategic bracing process. We set out criteria, and I think the Air Force does it in a way we try to be more transparent probably than the other services. I think that's a good thing. We try to base things on fairly objective criteria, as well as the warfighter's assessment of what do we really need. We're then very open about that and down select from that. I think that's a good way to do things. And General Basham had to put up with me pre-confirmation, and one of the things we were laughing about the other day, I think I had 52 one-on-one meetings with the United States senators before confirmation. In about 54 of those conversations, basics came up. So it's a high priority, and what I told every senator and what I've told the Air Force and said publicly is we will make decisions based on the best interests of the United States Air Force and national defense. There won't be any thumbs on the scale, and we'll be straightforward about it. And the same is true for the infrastructure we need for the long term. This budget proposal does include trying to advance another round of base realignment and closure that will allow us to do some of the detailed assessments that may need to be done about what are the long-term warfighting needs of the United States Air Force. And that's the way we should make those decisions.
Rebecca Grant, Iris Independent Research. You talked a little bit about European security. Would you give us your quick take on the Air Force posture and priorities in the Pacific? Thank you.
Obviously, we have important allies and thousands of troops and airmen in the Pacific. And my first assignment after the Academy was actually at Intel Center Pacific at Camp H.M. Smith, Hawaii. So we have significant equities there as well as forces there to meet emerging threats. Obviously, the North Korean and Chinese threat. There's a lot of water there and a lot of distance, and one of the things that we need is the ability to project power that way, not only with rotating forces and permanently stationed forces, but the ability to have tankers to be able to get there. And so one of the things this budget does with respect to tankers is we're gradually increasing the number of booms that are available from KC-135 and KC-46 tankers so we can project power around the world.
Yeah, hi, James Drew from Aviation Week. I'm just interested in your comments on the OAX experiment. Industry has put a lot of investment into that experiment, Sierra Nevada Corporation and Textron. And so I guess if it's just an experiment and not a procurement, what's the point? And also, how does the Air Force plan to attract industry investment and dollars in the future for these sorts of experiments if there's no follow-on procurement opportunities?
I didn't say there weren't any procurement opportunities or follow-ons. We're trying to learn things. And we're trying to do this in a way that doesn't drag this out for multiple years. It's not a procurement in the sense that we'll get to the end of this experiment and decide, we really think we should buy A or B. It's, we have a very strict and sometimes not very responsive procurement architecture that we all have to operate under, or that the Air Force has to operate under. This is a way to gather information about capability that exists to inform future decisions. And so this is an experiment. We hope to learn some things from it, and then once we learn some things from it, we'll be able to make better decisions going forward. And that could be for a procurement afterwards, but it could be that we don't. So it's okay to experiment, and I think that's one of the messages we're trying to send here. We don't have to do everything the way we've always done.
Steve Losey, Air Force Times. Can you give us some more of your thoughts on active duty in-strength beyond the 325,000 hoped for next year? Last year, there were some Air Force officials who were saying that they hoped to get in-strength back up to about 350,000 by the early to mid 2020s. Do you agree with that, or do you have different thoughts?
At the moment, the national security strategy of the United States is under review. And so I'm a believer that threat drives strategy, strategy drives force posture. I think we all, as a practical matter, believe that to be true. So we're in a situation now where the strategy is under review. That strategy should drive our force posture for the long term. I think any reasonable assessment of the world situation in which we find ourselves, we can't anticipate there will be a decline in need for air and space power. But I want to see the strategy and then have the stubby pencil guys say, okay, to support this strategy, this is what we really think we need. In the past 5 or 6 years, the Air Force has been living in a situation where instead of strategy-driven budgets or strategy-driven force structure, we have budget-driven force structure. And that caused the Air Force to deeply cut manpower after the sequester. There really wasn't much more they could do. I don't blame the people for making those decisions at the time. They had a much lower budget than they could sustain, and that resulted in a deep cut in personnel, and we're still struggling with that. Maybe one last question, Whit? I should never say that, because nobody knows. Over here?
Caroline Jog with George Washington University. I was wondering, thinking in terms of tomorrow, what are your goals and visions for the incoming and future airmen of the Air Force?
It's a good last question. I expect our airmen to do their duty. I expect them to live in accordance with our values. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. Every day, just try to do everything you're doing to the very best of your ability and serve the country. That's what I expect of every airman, and that's what I expect of myself. Thank you for the question.